Okay, things that you'll need to recognize because they'll swim up on you, and you'll, if you don't know that you're supposed to ignore them, you might spend some time wondering what they are. So, Psoas. We're a little bit higher up here. If we were to keep going down, we would encounter the iliac vessels lying on this side, but we're higher here. Remember, the psoas is a hip flexor muscle. It's going to pull on your femur, so you can go up 90 degrees with your femur. And it has to attach somewhere to do that pull. A bunch of where it attaches is paraspinally. So as you go further superior in the patient, it's going to run more medial and attach to the spine. So here it is running next to the spine with the overlying aorta, and as that aorta and IVC come down, they're going to split into the iliac vessels and start to run over here. And you can see with good compression, you can bring the patient's spine in typical kid right up to the skin. You can bring the psoas muscle right up to the skin, and we're displacing all the intestinal contents either to the patient's flank or medially when we do that. Now here's the trick. We always teach this like McBurney's point, and you want to go down to the psoas and start low and start rolling up over the iliac vessels so that you can find the appendix, which is going to run here. And this is perhaps more representative of where people's appendices actually lie. There's some debate about, like, is it really 32-64? Is it 50-50? But way more of them are retrocecal than we appreciate. And retrocecal does not always mean you can't access it. It just means it's not going to be found running over the psoas and down to the iliac vessels. It's going to come off the cecum and have a little pigtail around and make a little course underneath the cecum, and you may have to struggle a bit to find those. You may not be able to find those. So Adam Sivitz, who is probably the most experienced of the POCUS guys for appendicitis, he says, well, because so many of them are retrocecal, and probably more than 50% of them are retrocecal, why don't we start our scans in a way that's going to capture those ones? Why spend all this time down in the lower part of the right lower quadrant, like you'll often see me do, working your way up? And some of the reason I do it that way is that I was wrapping up my fellowship when Adam published these papers, and so I have my ingrained habits. But if I were to encourage people to do the most evidence-based thing, it would probably be to do a scanning order like this. So to start with your probe in a transverse orientation, slide over from the umbilicus until you get to the flank. If you can convince yourself that you've scanned the entire arches of the cecum as you work your way down, then you're covering the areas from which the appendix has to arise, right? So he says, cover the cecum, make your way down in transverse, and then if you haven't found it, you can slide over to that lower area where the iliac vessels start, and you can do some lawnmowing, just working your way up and down and up and down, and then at the end, to flip your probe into longitudinal and slide it back over. And this comes from his 2014 Annals of Emergency Medicine paper that was comparing the accuracy of POCUS by PEM physicians to a gold standard of final outcome. Okay. So, team, what things do you see? What's this? Awesome. What's this? Yeah. You might get small bowel. You might be able to see small bowel, especially if you take compression off, that jumps over the psoas. But by the time you're on this side of the psoas, it's almost all large bowel. Not always, but when you're this low, most of the time. And you can get below the cecum, right? You can have this kind of view, and that may be what's happening here, where it's like there's some points where I don't really see any air signal, and it looks maybe like there's some bad and non-specific stuff going on. So you can keep coming down over the cecum until it ends and still have this little ditch of kind of nothing, but maybe gristle in there where free fluid will occasionally accumulate. What's the thing coming in and out of view here? Maybe bladder. Yeah. Could it,
Spine.
could it be spine?
Maybe that could
Okay.
be spine.
And up here?
See the like vessels, and you see the appendix.
Yeah. So again, a very tough thing to distinguish a terminal ileum that I'm compressing really well, and so it's getting really small, from an appendix. The way to do it is to find the blind end, right? And finding the blind end can be really tough. You're talking about that maze, right? Snaky bow, and I'm cutting through this snake with a 1 millimeter long line whenever I do. So did I just get to a point where the snake made a 90-degree turn and I rolled off of it and I think that's the end of the snake? Did I miss the turn? You know, really convincing yourself that you've got the blind end can be tough. But that's what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to keep tracing this guy no matter where it goes, and see if we can find the blind end. You know, when you start to see it making this kind of jump here, you like wonder, is it going to head so medial and I'm just going to keep following it that like an appendix can't make it all the way over to the patient's left side? So I think it's not appendicitis or not an appendix, or is this the appendix? Is a tricky game to play. What can be tougher is recognizing, so that's like that tiny little target sign, right? Recognizing an appendix when you're capturing it in a long axis view can be trickier. So this is the, okay. And you know how I just was saying, you don't see small bowel that often on the lateral side of the psoas? Well, here you do. And this is what terminal ileum often looks like as it makes the jump over the psoas, but you're compressing it and it's going to blend and connect to not the cecum, but the large intestine. I guess the cecum, the ileocecal valve, a little bit higher up than this. Here's the kind of shadowing content within the cecum. And keep your eyes here, and you're going to see all of a sudden, bloop. So now watch and just look for the two-line structure of the appendix that's perfectly lying over top of the psoas there. You roll over it and we roll off it. It's the kind of thing where I would look at it and say, well, is it terminal ileum or is it appendix? Except I've got terminal ileum in the same shot. And I can see this thing come and make contact with the cecum. So I'm pretty convinced that's the appendix. Much easier to be confident about what you're seeing when it's abnormal and you can find it. So here's a blind-ended tubular structure. Psoas is over here, surrounded by inflamed fat. And some of the things people will talk about is like loss of some of the definition of the different mucosal and submucosal layers of the wall, and you can probably argue that some of that is happening in these shots also. So my little mnemonic that most people probably don't need, how big for the appendix again is too big. So you could use appendix. Append 6 millimeters is what has generally been used as a cutoff, with a big movement towards people saying 6 millimeters is probably too small and we should start to move towards 7. Other people saying, well, 6 is okay if you have prominent inflammatory features otherwise. And so that was an image of it, an appendicitis in longitudinal orientation. Here it is in short axis. What's this? And these? And this stuff? Yeah, hot fat. For those listening, we often use that term hot fat in our institution just because it's fun, instead of saying bright or inflamed or thickened mesenteric fat. Now, there's like hotter fat in a band here. Very nice. Very nice. Good job, group.